want to have justice for the victims, if we want to have justice be done, we need a tribunal, we need an office of the prosecutor. So I quit this commission.
War crimes prosecutor Carla Del Ponte has quit the United Nations in disgust over what she calls its failure to act. She says there's enough evidence out there to convict Syria's Bashar al Assad of war crimes, but yet there's still been no justice for Syrians. Well, some of the most damning evidence came to light 4 years ago with the release of photos known as the Caesar Files, named after the defector who smuggled the images out of the Syrian regime facilities. Rights groups say the signs of starvation and torture are clear evidence of state-sponsored crimes against humanity. Since then, the evidence has only continued to accumulate. But the UN Security Council remains debilitated by Russian and Chinese vetoes, and the International Criminal Court has no jurisdiction over Syria. Plus, any day now, the U.S. State Department may shut its war crimes office, adding to concerns that abuses could go unpunished. So now legal experts are pursuing what seems like the only feasible option left, filing a case in a European court. Spanish lawyers are trying to prosecute Assad's forces accused of killing a Spanish citizen's brother. One of the people advising the Spanish prosecutors is Ambassador Stephen Rapp. He is the former head of the U.S. War Crimes Office, and he joins me now from New York. Ambassador Rapp, thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin by asking you personally, how important is it to you that something is done to hold the Syrian regime accountable for the war crimes you believe it's committed?
I think it's extremely important. It's certainly the most important thing and the greatest challenge that any of us face in the field of justice. If the crimes that were committed in Syria, as you talked about, what's documented in the Caesar photos, tens of thousands of people tortured to death in government custody. Of course, we've had the attack on hospitals and doctors and humanitarian access, the use of chemical weapons. If all that can be done with impunity, then others will have the same idea when they come to deal with what they view as an insurgency, and none of us will be safe anywhere in the world. I mean, we've spent a great deal of effort globally, beginning at Nuremberg, but particularly in the 90s with Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and then with the International Criminal Court, to really lay the foundation for accountability. The idea, if you do these crimes, you may have to do the time. You may be prosecuted, and if it doesn't happen in Syria, that undermines, frankly, the whole system.
So how important to you is the U.S. War Crimes Office, and what will happen if it is indeed closed?
Well, it is very important, and keep in mind it's not just a Democratic initiative. I was ambassador at large for 6 years in the Obama administration, but it's been open for 20 years. We've had 4 ambassadors, 2 of them in Republican administrations, 2 in Democratic administrations, and strong support in our Congress. I think if the administration moves in this direction, we're actually confident that in Congress and an appropriations bill, they'll work to save the office. Obviously, there are certain things that need to be done in any case, and I'm sure the administration will say, well, this problem can be handled by an assistant secretary for Near East or whatever. But frankly, you need someone that's really focused on this issue and that has experience like all of us have had. I was a prosecutor in Rwanda and in Sierra Leone and tried a chief of state, Charles Taylor, and was convicted and sent to prison for 50 years. And my other colleagues, including the Republicans, had experience in the same way. And this allows us to work very effectively with courts, not just the international courts where we worked, but also with national authorities whose role is so essential in accountability.
But how do you counter the criticism you receive from countries, including Russia and even China, that your work is politically motivated? It's one-sided. The Russians have said, why don't you prosecute George W. Bush or Tony Blair over the millions of innocent deaths that occurred because of the Iraq War that was illegally declared through, in contrast of the United Nations? How do you contrast that, saying it is a political tool to prosecute only people and governments that the United States doesn't like?
will. And certainly I should note that in my tenure, we worked hard to prosecute people who committed horrible crimes allied with the United States, like the dictator of Guatemala, Rios Montt, who was eventually convicted of genocide, though on appeal it's been set aside, a new trial ordered, or Hissan Habre, who was the dictator of Chad, supported by President Reagan against Gaddafi in the 80s, but who tortured to death tens of thousands of his people. We supported the trial of him that recently convicted him in Senegal and sentenced him to life. I mean, no country is perfect in this regard, but the United States has exercised leadership in this area, and we believe in holding our own people to account. When Blackwater guards, attacked those civilians in Nisour Square, they were tried, those guards, even though they'd had great service records, and convicted and sentenced to long terms. They're still appealing that in terms of their sentence, and the government under President Trump is continuing to press for tough punishment. So we do believe in holding people to account. We prefer it at the national level, and when you talk about crimes, not necessarily crimes in terms of how a conflict began, but how it's fought, and whether civilians are intentionally targeted, whether you go in and want to kill all the Sunni or all the Yazidi or all the Shia, et cetera, in a particular area, or all the Tutsi, and target the civilians, not military targets, and sometimes civilians being killed by mistake. When you do that kind of thing, the U.S. is absolutely solid as a rock that we need to have accountability.
Okay. Now, as for the case that's been built against Bashar al Assad and the Syrian regime, how strong is your case? How much evidence do you genuinely have? And is it even worse? I heard Carla Del Ponte herself argue that the evidence is even stronger than what was given against Rwanda, the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide, as well as former Yugoslavia.
Well, I certainly agree with Carla. I worked with Carla. She appointed me as a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal, and she's correct in that regard. And part of it is the mania of the Syrian regime. They may have learned this from the Russians, I don't know whom, but they did an enormous amount of paperwork that actually does document the plan by Assad and his regime to suppress what was peaceful protest in the street. Not with a light touch, not with prosecuting people for real crimes, but by disappearing them into the detention facilities, killing tens of thousands, releasing some maimed and brutalized as a message to others: don't you dare raise your head, or you too will be destroyed. And this was done at the very highest level. We've got groups, of course, there's what Carla has done, which she was on this UN-created commission created by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which operates by majority vote and can't be blocked by veto. And it's done great reports every 6 months about the various crimes. But others have gone in there more deeply, supported by various governments, including this group called CIJA, which is supported by government groups, has 130 Syrians working with it, and they've brought out 750,000 pages of regime documents and analyzed all of it. They have 1 million names in their database of Syrian victims and perpetrators. And so it is immense evidence. It's even better than we had against the Nazis, to be frank.
Okay.
So it's there. Now, of course, yeah, there's something else that's happening that I did want to mention, but go ahead, please.
No, go ahead then. Do finish.
Well, I was going to say that, Carla is not the only UN game in town. This Commission of Inquiry from Geneva, because of the blockage of the Security Council in New York, the General Assembly, under the leadership of European and countries in the region, moved a resolution to create a mechanism that's like an office of the prosecutor. It passed the UN by a vote of 105 to 15, and it's being stood up in Geneva, and it will build cases. Now, it has no court to take those to at the international level, but it'll work very closely with European courts. And
Right.
you mentioned the Spanish case, but there are also cases in Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, and work with those countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to get out and interview witnesses in refugee camps and all of that, but they can help provide that evidence that fits a national system And we can see some cases proceeding that way. So something else is being done beyond the Commission of Inquiry, which will certainly continue even with Carla no longer on it.
I mean, as you've said, the evidence is there, but the legal infrastructure isn't. You're trying this case in Spain now, but it has been delayed. In fact, it may be eliminated if this next appeal doesn't work. If that is the case, what other legal channels are there? What can you do?
Well, there are other, in Germany at the moment, Germany has universal jurisdiction. It can try any case from anywhere in the world, whether it has the perpetrators or victims as among its citizens or among its residents. It, of course, has tens of thousands of Syrians that have come there and have been provided with refuge. And it has an immense number of them that survived the torture chambers and whose families died there. And they have to make a determination that it's in their public interest, proceed with these kind of cases. And they're in an active investigative phase. They've been interviewing witnesses. They've got the evidence from the Caesar files. They have other evidence from CIJA, the ones that I described, the 750,000 pages, and they're analyzing it. It's believed by the end of the year that they will begin a formal prosecution, which could include senior regime figures in Syria. Now, of course, will those people come to trial in Stuttgart or somewhere? Not right away, but international arrest warrants can go out by Interpol, and if those folks are traveling somewhere in Asia and they think they're safe, bam, they can get arrested at a border and shift off to Germany. And it's sort of a signal to them that for as long as they live, they're going to face the prospect of justice. And we've seen in other cases where people think they're going to get away with it, like somebody like Habre, 27 years after he's overthrown, is convicted and sentenced for life in an African country 2,000 miles away from his home. So this does indicate that there will be some justice in Syria. But the best place for justice in Syria, of course, is in Syria, and that has to be an essential part of any peace agreement.
Indeed. Okay, Stephen Rapp, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Okay, well, enjoyed speaking with you this morning. Take care.